Well, good morning, brethren. It's good to be up here with you all again, and welcome also to anyone joining us on Zoom today. Now, last time that I was up here, I began a series entitled The Geography of the Holy Land, to better appreciate the geographical background of the stories of the Bible and better appreciate the land that God himself chose for his chosen people. Now, in the first part, we went through an overview of the Holy Land and then covered the north of Israel. So today we're going to explore central Israel. Now today we're going to explore a little bit deeper into the archaeology of the Holy Land and also look at how that archaeology can give us a better feel for many of the biblical events that took place in this part of Israel. Now in the process I will cover more on the chronology and dating issues that impact the interpretation of Israel's archaeology. So it will at times get a little bit technical, but I will aim to make it clearly and simply as possible for you. Now, the value of exploring these dating issues are that there are some amazing new insights into Bible history and the ancient world when we actually get the chronology right. So today we're going to explore two different regions in the central part of Israel. We're going to start with the Sharon coastal plain, and then we'll move inland and explore the region of Samaria in the central highlands. Now, the Sharon plain is the central section of Israel's coastal plain. Now, the plain lies between the Mediterranean Sea to the west and the Samarian hills, about 15 kilometres or 9 miles to the east. Now, the plain thins to less than 5 kilometres wide as you go further north of Caesarea. Now, the plain of Sharon is referred to several times in the book of 1 Chronicles and Isaiah, as well as the reference to the Rose of Sharon in the Song of Songs. Now, the word Sharon itself simply means plain or flat land. Now, most of the plain was in the territory of Manasseh. Now, the Sharon plain north of the Yarkon River, which flows through the northern part of Tel Aviv, was allotted to Manasseh. Now, the area south of the Yarkon River was divided between Dan and Ephraim. Now, the western part below the Yarkon River around Joppa or Jaffa was in the area of the tribe of Dan. The eastern part was in Ephraim, including Aphek and Lod. Now, we're going to look at 7 places along the Sharon plain so far here. So we're going to start with Joppa, which is today called Jaffa or Yaffo, then Tel Aviv, before moving inland and look at Lod or Lydda, and then Aphek. And after Aphek, we'll head north to the resort city of Netanya, and then the ancient seaport of Caesarea, before finishing at the ancient city of Dor. Now, Joppa or Jaffa is an ancient seaport just south of the modern city of Tel Aviv, which has quite a lovely old world charm about it. Now, Joppa is first noted as the port through which the cedars of Lebanon for Solomon's temple came into before being taken up to Jerusalem. Now, Joppa was also the port from which Jonah sailed from towards Tarshish in order to avoid God's call to preach to Nineveh of Assyria. Now, in the New Testament, is first mentioned as where the charitable Tabitha, also known as Dorcas, was raised by God back to life through Peter in Acts chapter 9. Now, the following chapter, Acts 10, tells the story of Peter being at Simon the tanner's place in Joppa and having a vision about unclean animals that related to the Gentiles. Now, following the vision, he set off to see Cornelius, the centurion at Caesarea, where the first group of Gentiles received the Holy Spirit. Now, Tel Aviv is the economic and technological centre of the nation with a population of about 500,000. Now, the city was founded in 1909 as a modern housing estate on the outskirts of the ancient port city of Jaffa. Now, Tel Aviv means the tell of the spring. So a tell is an ancient mound and spring signifies the new year. So the name is a combination of the old and the new. Now, Tel Aviv today is the hedonistic counterpart to the more spiritual Jerusalem. Now, like most Western nations, Israel follows much of the woke, politically correct ideology that is infecting the West. Now, one example that I saw along the main esplanade was a number of gay pride banners that you see here. Now, on a more positive side, you do get to see some quite spectacular sunsets over the Mediterranean Sea there. Now, today there are three major highways that run north to south along the length of the coastal plain. Now, those highways are numbered 2, 4 and 6. Now, Highway 2 goes south from Haifa along the coast down to Tel Aviv. Now, Highway 4 splits off from it south of Haifa and goes along the coast just a little bit inland from Highway 2. Now, Highway 6 is a toll road for much of its length, and it goes from just north of Beersheba in the very south and goes along the eastern edge of the Sharon coastal plain. And it then bends east to go through the Yokneam Pass, which is further north of the other major pass that goes through the Carmel Range. Now, that other pass, the Aruna or Megiddo Pass, is traversed by Highway 65, which splits off from Highway 2 a little south of Caesarea. And it goes through the pass and then continues through the middle of the Jezreel Valley, then passing below Nazareth and the Mount of Precipice. Now, the ancient Via Maris followed today's Highway 65 through the Aruna Pass, and then when it reached the coastal plain, it turned south and followed the path of today's Highway 6. Now, where it leaves the coastal plain and starts going through the Aruna Pass, it passes the Arab town of Kefir Kara, which is quite an impressive looking town when you come into it on the slopes of the Carmel Range with a couple of lovely gold dome mosques. Now, one further road to note here is the tunnel that goes under the Carmel Range a little south of Haifa, noted as Highway 23. Now, looking now at the southern half of the plain of Sharon, the major road noted in red here is Highway 1, which goes from Tel Aviv up to Jerusalem. Now, you'll see the three major north-south roads here that we just looked at, Highways 2, 4 and 6. Now, where Highway 2 reaches the outskirts of Tel Aviv, another road, the 20, splits off to its east before the 2 and the 20 merge together further south. And then the 20 joins up with Highway 1. Now, further east of that junction, in between Highways 4 and 6, along Highway 1, is Ben Gurion Airport. Now, another road to note here in yellow is the road known as Highway 5, which runs from just north of Tel Aviv eastward. Now, it passed Tel Afek near the junction with Highway 6 and continued into the Sumerian highlands just north of Shiloh, where it connected with Highway 60, which follows the ancient road of the patriarchs. Now, that whole network of highways from around Netanya through Tel Aviv to Lod on the way up to Jerusalem was just awful to drive through, being so congested, and we had lots and lots of roadworks when we were there. Now, the traffic through there is one of the worst things about Israel today. Now, Jerusalem is also heavily congested and actually very easy to get lost in, even with a GPS, which can often lead you up the garden path. Now, the rest of the country, however, is a whole lot better. Now, I personally prefer being in the north of Israel, which is much less congested and a lot greener. Now, going inland from the town of Lod was at the intersection of the road to Joppa from Jerusalem and the inland road that went south from Afek and connected up with the Philistine towns further south, such as Ekron and Gath. Now, in Roman times, Lod was known as Lydda. Now, on his way to Joppa, Peter stayed at Lydda and healed a paralysed man by the name of Aeneas. Now, Acts 9:35 notes that after the miracle, so all who dwelt at Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now, about 20 kilometres northeast of Tel Aviv is the ancient site of Tel Afek. Now, Tel Afek is close to the springs that feed the Yarkon River that empty into the Mediterranean just north of Tel Aviv. Now, it's sat at an important crossroads. The most important ancient road that passed through Israel was the Via Maris, or Way of the Sea, which was the international highway that connected Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, it was a vital road for trade and the passage of armies through the land of Israel. Now, after crossing the Jezreel Valley, it went through the Aruna Pass near Megiddo and through the Carmel Range. It then went down the eastern edge of the Sharon Plain, where today's Highway 6 travels, before heading to Joppa or Jaffa after it got to the town of Aphek. Now, from there it continued on past towns such as Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, and onto Egypt. Now, another road beginning at Aphek continues south parallel with the Via Maris, going through important towns such as Lod, Ekron, and Gath. Now, Aphek was naturally a strategically important place, as it had a water source, and there was a narrow corridor between where you could travel north between the Yarkon River on the left and the Sumerian hills without actually having to cross the Yarkon River. Now, Tel Aphek was where the Philistines were camped, which is close to the springs which feed the Yarkon River that empty into the Mediterranean just north of Tel Aviv. Now, just coming up now to the Crusader Castle. In the back there you can see the springs of the Yarkon River. Okay, now we're heading east. Now, on the opposite side of Highway 6 there is a site that has been identified as the biblical Ebenezer, where the Israelites were camped. Now, we're looking here at the battleground where some 30,000 Israelite men lost their lives in the battle where the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant. Now, today there are the remains of a Crusader castle here, but in Roman times this site was known as Antipatris, and it was where Paul passed through as he was being taken by the Roman guards from Jerusalem up to Caesarea before he was imprisoned there. Now, because of its strategic location on the plain of Sharon, Aphek was a base for the Egyptians when they had control over the land of Israel. Now, just as there were remains connected to Ramses the Great of the 19th dynasty found at Bethshan, so too were artefacts connected to Ramses the Great found here at Tel Aphek. Now, when we looked at Bethshan in part 1, we saw the confusion created when victory stelas of Ramses the Great and his father Seti were not found in the late Bronze 2B level, but were found in the later strata that was identified because of many other finds as Iron Age 2. Now, one of the excavators, Rowe, rather than question the standard chronology that places Ramses the Great centuries earlier, made an assumption that somehow these stelas had been thrown up in the Tel to the much later strata level. Now, which time period in the Bible best fits the time of Ramses the Great and his father Seti, who ruled Egypt and controlled the land of Israel? Well, the standard chronology places Ramses' reign around 1250 BC. Now, this date, according to the Bible, is midway through the time of the Judges. Now, in Exodus 1:11, it says that the Israelites built the city of Ramses, thought to be Pi-Ramses. Now, this is why many people date the Exodus as late as 1250 BC and have Ramses the Great as the pharaoh of the Exodus, as seen in the movie The Ten Commandments. Now, such a late date only allows a mere 200 years for all the judges to squeeze into, which simply doesn't work. Now, David Roll places the time of Ramses the Great around 950 BC, and he believes he ruled during the latter part of Solomon's reign and into the reign of Rehoboam. Now, he believes that he was the pharaoh called Shishak in the Bible who plundered the temple of all of its treasures. Now, Immanuel Velikovsky places his reign in the latter part of the kingdom of Judah around 600 BC before it fell to the Babylonians, believing that Ramses the Great was the pharaoh that the Bible refers to as Necho. Now, the problem with putting the 19th dynasty as during the middle of the Judges, where the standard chronology places it, is that the Bible is silent on any Egyptian military action, despite it recording most other nations oppressing Israel at one time or the other. Now, there's a similar mismatch with David Rohl's placement of Ramses the Great. Now, we saw at Beth Shan that Ramses the Great and his father Seti both had victory steles erected there. Now, while this would be possible during the reign of Rehoboam, this is a mismatch for the reigns of David and Solomon, where Seti and the early half of Ramses' reign are placed on David Rohl's timeline. Now, can the finds of Ramses the Great at Tel Afek give us any better clarity as to when Ramses the Great ruled? Now, in his book Ages in Order, Alan Montgomery writes the following. At Tel Afek, the Egyptian residence in level X12 was destroyed in the Late Bronze II. The destruction in level X12 is ascribed to the latter part of Ramses II, partly because of the pottery. Now, what evidence is there that Ramses II lived during level X12? In a stone trough outside the gates of level X12 residence, a scarab of Usamatre Setepenre was found. Now, the conventional view claims that it is the 13th dynasty or 1250 BC. Thus, Usamatre Setepenre is Ramses II. There is also a plaque of Ramses II. Now, has it now been established that Ramses II is associated with late Hellenic III pottery, which belongs to the Late Bronze IIb period? Well, not exactly. Most scholars have associated the plaque with the destruction of the Egyptian residence, but in fact it was not found in that stratum. It was found in a silo of iron II. End of quote. So on one hand, we have a scarab with the pronomen name of Ramses the Great in the Late Bronze IIb, and then on the other hand we have a plaque of Ramses the Great that was found in a silo of Iron Age II period. Now, how can we know for sure which is the correct time period for the reign of Ramses the Great? Now, I mentioned last time I spoke about Bethshan that there was evidence in Turkey that supported a much later date for Ramses the Great. Now, Ramses the Great of the 19th dynasty fought the Hittites and later made a peace treaty with one of the last Hittite rulers, Hattusilus III. Now, because of this very clear synchronism between Ramses the Great and that late Hittite emperor, the date of 1200 BC, provided by Egyptologists, was then able to be applied to date the Imperial Hittite Empire and its end. Now, this, however, left a major gap in the history of the Hittite region, with absolutely no Hittite history being able to be used to fill in those centuries between the Hittite Empire and the Neo-Hittite period, which later followed centuries later. Now, what made the situation even more strange was that the Neo-Hittite cities of southeast Turkey and northern Syria displayed a culture that is identical with the Hittite Empire that supposedly came to its end hundreds of years earlier. Now, Alan Montgomery writes the following. At Gordian, after World War II, the excavator, an American named Young, identified a stratum related to the time of King Midas in level 3. Now, if you recall, King Midas was the Phrygian king who had the Midas touch of being able to turn things into gold. Now, the top stratum, level 1, was clearly identified as belonging to the time of the Persians. That's the top layer. The Phrygian kingdom came to an end when it was attacked by the Sumerians in 687 BC. Now, this left the level 2 stratum sandwiched neatly between these two very precise dates of 687 and 548 BC. The problematic level 2 stratum contained a copious amount of Hittite pottery and telltale pictographic hieroglyphics. Now, Young claimed that the clay he saw containing the imperial New Hittite seals and material came to Gordon from Hittite territory and had formed a 4-metre layer over all of Gordian. Now, Young states, for the purposes of dating, the shards or layer of clay are of little use. They are almost entirely Hittite. The pottery was a deposit already in the clay when it was brought in from elsewhere to be laid down over the surface of the Phrygian city mount. Now, Young's explanation fails to address why the Persians would want to perform this task. In no other site did any conquering power perform such a feat. It would take an immense amount of manpower to transport such a layer over 100 miles, end of quote. So we see that level 2 must date between 687 and 548 BC. Now, level 2 was full of Hittite artefacts, yet we are told that the Hittite Empire came to its end at the end of the late Bronze Age, conventionally dated to 600 years earlier, around 1200 BC. Now, we had Hattusa, another Hittite city, its capital. In the top 2 layers, there was found a mix of Greek pottery from the 7th BC with Hittite seals and pottery supposedly dated to the 13th century BC. Now, the archaeology at these 2 sites, amongst other evidence, demands a much later date for the late Hittite Empire. Now, because this empire gets its date from a clear synchronism between Ramses the Great, that would also demand a similar reduction in the date of the reign of Ramses the Great. But what about that scarab of Ramses the Great found in the late Bronze level at Tel Afek? Well, Alan Montgomery notes that the pronomen name of Ramses II, Usermatre Setepenre, that this name was not unique amongst the pharaohs. In fact, there was a Libyan pharaoh or 2 that had this same pronomen name. So archaeologists may well be assuming that scarabs of a Libyan dynasty pharaoh are actually those of Ramses the Great. They are not. Now, Ramses the Great fought the Hittites while Necho fought the Babylonians. Now, this situation where he argued that the battles of Kadesh and Carchemish were one and the same led to arguably Velikovsky's greatest mistake in equating the Babylonian Empire with the Hittites. Now, Barry Kernock sees these 2 empires of the Hittites and the Babylonians as allies in the Battle of Carchemish against the waning Assyrians who were allied by Egypt. Now, around that time, there was this back and forth battle for control of the lands of Israel and Syria near the end of the kingdom of Judah between the Babylonians and Egypt, with them changing hands several times before Babylon gained the upper hand. Now, according to Velikovsky, Ramses the Great did play a significant role in biblical history, but not as the pharaoh of the Exodus as he is commonly portrayed, but as the great Egyptian competitor with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Velikovsky highlights the remarkable parallels in the war annals of Ramses and events that are described in the Bible during the late years of the kingdom of Judah. Now, coming back to the present and continuing on with our tour of the plain of Sharon, the next place on our tour is the modern resort city of Netanya, which is just over 30 kilometres north of Tel Aviv. Now, it's set on a high cliff face above the Mediterranean with a lovely esplanade and beach. Now, here's another view of Netanya, which is the view that I remember driving up the highway. Now, from this view, it looks more like a concrete jungle. Now, Netanya also is the base of the Messianic ministry, One for Israel, and where they have their own Bible college. Now, it's amazing how little impact Christianity has had in modern times trying to convert Jews living in the land of Israel itself to Christianity and accepting Jesus as the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament. Now, it's also amazing when you find out how much blowback there is too in the Jewish community to those Jews who do convert to Christianity in the land of Israel. Now, despite those challenges, this Israel-based ministry has been making quite an impact in Israel over the last few years. Now, they've got some very good YouTube videos proving Jesus is the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament, which is basically what the apostles would have been spending much of their time preaching about when they were in their ministry. And this ministry also has some great videos on the biblical significance of the Hebrew festivals. Now, about another 20 kilometres further north of Netanya is Caesarea Maritima. Now, it was built as a port city by Herod the Great between 25 and 13 BC. Now, with his usual magnificence, Herod lavished adornments on the city. Now, he erected sumptuous palaces, a theatre, a hippodrome for chariot races, and a sewer under the city. Now, the mighty breakwater was constructed by letting down giant stones into the deep water and using a form of concrete that's actually set underwater. An incredible innovation for the time. Now, between 41 and 44 AD, there was a brief 3-year restoration of the kingdom of the Herod kingdom over Judea, where Herod Agrippa I ruled before he died miserably when he accepted the worship of the people at Caesarea, probably at the theatre, as discussed in Acts 12. Now, rule over Judea was given back to the Roman prefects after his death, and we're told that 2 of them, specifically in the book of Acts, were Felix and Festus. Now, Caesarea was first introduced to Christianity by Philip the deacon in Acts 40, who later had a house there in which he gave hospitality to the Apostle Paul in Acts 21. Now, it was there that the Apostle Peter came and baptised Cornelius the centurion and his household, who became the first Gentile converts to receive the Holy Spirit noted in Acts 20. And we're coming up now to the theatre, where likely the likely location of that incident with Herod Agrippa I. And looking now at the palace of Herod the Great, and looking now at the hippodrome, where there's chariot races. Now, when the newly converted Apostle Paul was in danger in Jerusalem, the Christians there accompanied him to Caesarea and sent him off to his native Tarsus on his first missionary journey, I think it was. Now, he visited Caesarea also between his second and third missionary journeys in Acts 18, and he later stayed there several days with Peter the deacon. And that's the port there. Now, here's another view of the palace that Herod the Great built. Now, during the latter reigns of the Roman prefects Felix and Festus around 60 AD, Paul was imprisoned here for about 2 years. Now, at the end of giving his defence, he appealed to Rome, and he was then sent off to Rome from there. Now, in the 1960s, an inscription was found at Caesarea which had on it the name of Pontius Pilate, who ruled Judea and gave the order to have Jesus crucified. Now, today there's a replica of it near Herod's palace. Now, the port area has been wonderfully restored and made into a restaurant precinct, and quite a number of our group there went snorkelling there in the harbour. And we had a great dinner here. I think my meal was that great big pizza in the middle. Now, just north of Caesarea is the impressive aqueduct that brought water into the city that was built by Herod the Great. Now, another 20 kilometres further north of Caesarea is the location of Dor. Now, Haifa is about another 30 kilometres on from Dor, further north. And we're looking here at the beautiful beaches to the south of the Tel. And here we're looking at the ancient Tel itself, just on that headland. Now, the ancient Tel at Dor was a Canaanite city that was part of the Northern Alliance that was defeated by Joshua. Now, Dor was a place that actually harvested the mollusks that produced the blue and the purple dyes that were very valuable in the ancient world. Now, truly, Dor is one of the most beautiful beaches in all of the coast of Israel along the Mediterranean coast. And continuing further north of Dor are a couple of other scenic sites. One is the small peninsula of Atlit with a ruined castle on. And in the right photo are the southern beaches of Haifa at the very top of the plain of Sharon. Well, that concludes the Sharon plain. So shall we take a break, or do you want a hymn? Do you want a hymn? No, I feel like a break. I've had my Kit Kat, so I'm ready to go. Now, the other region that we're going to look at today is the region of Samaria. Now, shown in red here is the ridge route, or the way of the patriarchs, as Abraham, Isaac and Jacob used this road often to journey between Shechem, Bethel, Hebron and Beersheba. Now, today is called Route 60. Now, at the southern end of Samaria, about 20 kilometres north of Jerusalem, is Bethel, where Jacob had his dream of a stairway to heaven. Now, to its east was the fortress of Ai that Joshua conquered after Jericho fell. Now, a little northeast of Bethel and Ai is the town of Ephraim, where Jesus actually stayed after he resurrected Lazarus. Now, to the northwest of Bethel is the town of Timnath Serah. Now, this is where Joshua, who's from the tribe of Ephraim, was buried. Now, going further north is Shiloh, where the tabernacle was during the time of the judges. Now, those first few locations there were in the territory of the half-tribe of Ephraim, which had the bottom third of the area of Samaria. Now, the rest of Samaria belonged to the tribe of Manasseh. Now, bisecting the Samarian highlands, shown here in yellow, is a valley that zigzags all the way from west to east. Now, in Hebrew, the word for valley is Nahal, and in Arabic, the word is Wadi. Now, west of Shechem, the valley is called Nahal Shechem. Now, it then bends north when it gets to Shechem and passes through Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Now, it changes name to Wadi Medan until it bends south at Tirzah, where it changes name again to Wadi Farah before it goes into the Jordan River Valley. Now, when Jacob returned from Haran, he turned off the King's Highway in Jordan and went down the Jabbok River Valley, wrestled with God at Penuel. Then he turned south at Succoth. He would then cross over the Jordan at Adam, and then went up that valley past Tirzah and then on to Shechem, where he stayed for a while. And you can see the route that he took in green there before he gets into the valley. Now, Shechem was also the first place in Israel where Abraham went to, and it's likely he took the same route as Jacob did. Now, Shechem, in the centre of Samaria, was also the first capital of the northern kingdom after Israel split into two. Now, its second capital was Tirzah, and its third capital was Samaria, to the west of Shechem. Now, going further north was the town of Dothan, which is where Joseph was sold into slavery. And west of Shechem and Shiloh are two possible candidates for Pirathon, which is mentioned in the book of Judges. Now, shown in yellow here are the three passes that go through the Mount Carmel range. The Yokneam Pass, the Megiddo or Aruna Pass, which is guarded by the city of Megiddo, and the Dothan Pass. Now, the Mount Carmel range is that part of the Samarian highlands that juts out northwest all the way to the coast at Haifa. Now, also jutting out from the northeastern part of the Samarian highlands is the Mount Gilboa range. Now, the kings of Dor, Yokneam, Megiddo, Shimron, and Tanakh were all part of that northern alliance that Joshua defeated north of Hatzor. Now, the city of Ibleam sits at the northern end of the Way of the Patriarchs before it descends down to Jezreel. Now, if you remember in the story about Ahab and his household, after Jehu killed Ahab's son Joram, Jehu chased after the king of Judah, who went by the name of Ahaziah, who was the son of Jezebel's wicked daughter Athaliah. Now, as Ahaziah was fleeing from Jezreel up to Ibleam via the ascent of Gur, Ahaziah was shot by an arrow, and then he turned to Megiddo, where he eventually died. Now, the shaded area in the middle of the map on the left is the area that is today called the West Bank. Now, this area was captured from Jordan by Israel during the Six-Day War of 1967. Now, while Israel has overall control, certain parts within the West Bank, designated Area A, are off limits to Israelis, as noted on the sign on the left. Now, places such as Shechem, Samaria, Bethlehem and Hebron, which are all dripping in Bible history, are all designated as Area A. Now, tourists can visit these areas, but not with a car registered in Israel. Now, one option to visit these areas includes the few organised tours that go there, such as those run by Todd Fink of Holy Land Site Ministries, or those run by archaeologist Joel Kramer. Now, alternatively, you can hire a Palestinian tour guide to take you to them, which is a fairly expensive option that I couldn't afford this time around, but I plan to on a future trip. Now, Israel's settlement during the time of the Judges is shown in pink in the map on the right. Now, the rest of the land was controlled by the Philistines along the southern coast and the Canaanites along the north coast and the Jezreel Valley. Now, what is ironic today is that this is a mirror image of the settlement in Israel today. Now, today the Palestinians are found mostly in the Central Highlands, while the Israelis live mostly in the coastal region, the Jezreel Valley and the Galilee. Now, Samaria was the heartland of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, who were the sons of Joseph. Now, after Jacob moved to Egypt, Jacob blessed the two sons of Joseph and prophesied that one, Manasseh, would become a great nation, and his other son, Ephraim, would become a group of nations. Now, before the Assyrian captivity, the tribe of Ephraim was never a group of nations. It was originally a tribe within the United Kingdom of Israel, and then the northern kingdom of Israel after Solomon. Now, notice here that Jacob says that the younger son, Ephraim, was to be the greater. Now, when the tribe of Joseph occupied the Promised Land up to the time of the Assyrian captivity, it was always Manasseh that had the much greater territory in the land than Ephraim. So that itself implies that Genesis 48:19 is a future prophecy after the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom. Now, the only way for this prophecy in Genesis 48:19 to come true is if it occurred after the northern kingdom went into captivity. Now, can we see any evidence in world history of two brother nations where one became great and the other became greater as a group of nations? Now, this is the basis for our United Church of God teaching that Britain and America are descended from Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh, fulfilling many end-time prophecies, including many relating to the Great Tribulation. Now, the first place we're going to look at in Samaria is where Israel's history in the Holy Land begins, the town of Shechem. Now, Shechem is in the centre of Samaria. Now, Israel's first noted stop in the Holy Land after leaving Mesopotamia was the city of Shechem. Now, we read in Genesis 12:6 and 7, it says, Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the oak tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now God here visibly appeared to Moses and promised him and his descendants this land. Now when it talks about the oak tree of Moreh, it may have been the one thought to have been in front of the sanctuary at ancient Shechem in Joshua's time, though some place it on a nearby mountain to the east. Now Jacob also dwelt here for a time after he returned with his tribe of wives, concubines, his 12 sons, and a daughter named Dinah. Now a local prince, also called Shechem, fell for her and seduced her. Now after a covenant was struck with the local Canaanites to resolve the matter, which included circumcision, 2 of Jacob's hot-headed sons, Simeon and Levi, led an assault on the Canaanites, killing many of them, which led to the household of Jacob leaving Shechem. Now before departing for Bethel, Jacob purged his household of all the household idols, burying them under an oak tree here at Shechem. Now the Israelites returned to Shechem after the conquest was completed and renewed their covenant with God again at Shechem, which we read about in Joshua 24. Now half of the tribes were on Mount Gerizim on the left, and the other half on Mount Ebal on the right here, which is to the north of Shechem. Now the priests read each of the blessings noted in Leviticus 26, and the tribes on Mount Gerizim would say amen to each of them. Now likewise, each of the curses were read, and the tribes of Mount Ebal would call out amen after each were read as part of renewing this covenant. Now the 2 mountains serve as a natural amphitheatre here. Now imagine the scene with around 2 million people, half on each side, saying amen to each of the blessings and the cursings. It would have been a very dramatic scene indeed. Now in Hebrew, the letters B and V are somewhat interchangeable, such as Beersheba and Beersheba, for example. Now Mount Ebal can also be referred to as Mount Eval. Now it's very similar to our English word evil, which may possibly come from, as both words mean cursing or affliction. Now at this time, Joshua set up a large stone pillar near the oak that was in front of the sanctuary of God, where a fortress temple was later built. Now that actual covenant stone may well be the same stone that was found by archaeologist Ernest Sellon when he excavated the site. Now it was re-erected in front of the remains of what is called a fortress temple because of its massive thick walls that were destroyed by fire in the Middle Bronze Age. Now they also buried the bones of Joseph that were taken from Egypt there in the plot of land that his father Jacob had bought. Now fittingly, Joseph was laid to rest in the tribal area of his son Manasseh. Now Shechem is an important site that helps us to better understand the dating issues in relation to the Exodus and the conquest. Now there are 2 major reasons why secular archaeologists dismiss the biblical account of the Exodus and the conquest. Now the first is the complete absence of any great catastrophe in the records of Egypt's 18th and 19th dynasties, the 2 Egyptian dynasties where the Exodus is usually placed on Egypt's timeline. And it forms the period that archaeologists refer to as the Late Bronze Age. Now not only is there no record of any great catastrophe that we would expect from the plagues that God brought on Egypt, but actually the opposite is the case for this period of Egyptian history. Now the 18th and 19th dynasties, or the Late Bronze Age, is the time of Egypt's golden age when it expanded furthest in the ancient world. Now the second reason that secular archaeologists dismiss the account of the Exodus is shown in the chart on the right. The fact that most of the cities identified from Joshua's conquest were not even occupied, let alone destroyed during the Late Bronze Age. Now, there are 4 different approaches to the problem of matching the archaeological record with the biblical account of the Exodus and the conquest. Now, the first is the view of most secular scholars such as Israel Finkelstein and William Dever. Now, they believe that because of the great inconsistencies between the late Bronze archaeology and the biblical account, that the stories of the Exodus and the conquest can be written off without having any historical basis. Now, the second approach is the view that the standard chronology is correct and the Bible is only partly true, and by extension, it is partly false. Now, this is the view of liberal scholars, Bible scholars such as William Albright, Kenneth Kitchen, and the main contributors to the Biblical Archaeological Review magazine. Now, the dominant view amongst these is that the Exodus took place during the 19th dynasty around 1250 BC. Now, the third approach to the problem is that the standard chronology of Egypt is correct and the Bible is also true. Now, this is the approach taken by the Associates of Bible Research, led by Bible-believing archaeologists Brian Wood and Scott Stripley. Now, as we have seen with the cities of Joshua's conquest and the lack of matches in the late Bronze archaeology, there is a major challenge to reconcile the Bible with the archaeology of the late Bronze Age. Now, the final approach to the Exodus problem is that the Bible is true and that the standard chronology itself is faulty. Now, this is the approach of revisionists such as Emanuel Velikovsky, David Rohl, and John Bimson. Now, as shown in the right-hand column of this chart, we have seen that most of the cities identified from Joshua's conquest were not even occupied during the period of the late Bronze Age. However, when we look earlier on Egypt's timeline during the Middle Bronze Age, there was a great collapse of Egyptian civilization at the end of the Middle Kingdom, and as seen in the left-hand column here of the chart, the cities of Joshua's conquest had high walls, as referred to in the book of Joshua, and all of them suffered destruction during the Middle Bronze Age, what we'd actually expect if we took the biblical account at heart. Now, it's because of this compelling pattern of evidence in the Middle Bronze Age why some scholars such as David Rohl, John Bimson, Emanuel Velikovsky, and filmmaker Tim Mahoney in his Patterns of Evidence film on the Exodus advocate that mainstream archaeology has overstretched the Egyptian timeline and that the Exodus and conquest occurred during the Middle Bronze Age. Now, for those who take a more literal approach to the scriptures, there are 2 options that we have been offered to us to try and reconcile the physical evidence of the archaeology with the historical biblical account of the Exodus and conquest. Now, one option is to accept the Middle Bronze Age dating of the destruction levels found at the cities that Joshua conquered and instead move the dating of the Middle Bronze Age itself down to the biblical date of around 1400 BC for the conquest. Now, the other is that offered by Brian Wood, who supports the standard chronology and believes that the Exodus took place during the 18th dynasty around 1450 BC. Now, his way around the problem of so many cities that Joshua conquered having no late Bronze destruction or occupation is to redate the local pottery, thereby redating the Middle Bronze Age destruction levels to the time of the late Bronze Age. Now, he's done this with the archaeology at Jericho and Ai, and by extension, this could be applied to all the cities of Joshua's conquest. So, which is the correct approach? Well, there is, in my opinion, a perfect test case to determine which is the best approach to reconcile the physical evidence of the archaeology with the biblical account of the Exodus and conquest, and that is the archaeology at Shechem. Now, at Shechem, there is a 3-step pattern that perfectly matches what the Bible records about this site. Now, in the time of the Judges, Gideon's wicked son Abimelech, who had his 70 brothers killed, fought against the men of Shechem and killed them. Now, Judges 9:46 says that the men of the tower of Shechem heard and entered into the stronghold of the house of the god Berith. Now this temple of Berith was also a tower and a stronghold. Now at Shechem, the remains of a temple and fortress were found there with massive thick walls that were 5 metres or 17 feet thick that was destroyed in the Middle Bronze 2C period. Now Alan Montgomery in his book Ages in Order has this to say about the archaeology at Shechem. Selon, as the first excavator of Shechem, discovered in 1926 a large temple with 17-foot walls measuring 68 by 489 feet. It certainly fit the requirements. Toombs, a co-excavator of Wright, stated, "The final destruction of Middle Bronze 2C Shechem displays a calculated ferocity and intent to cause complete destruction of the city. Shechem lay in ruins for, for about a century until its rebuilding in the Late Bronze 1B." End of quote. Now the archaeology shows the exact same 3-step pattern of evidence as described in the biblical account. However, the dating does not match the conventional dating, which places the time of Abimelech around the transition between the Late Bronze and the Iron Age, and Jeroboam I, who rebuilt the place in the Iron Age. Now, if we redate the Middle Bronze destruction at Shechem to the transition period between the Late Bronze and Iron Age, there is still then a century or more of Shechem being unoccupied before it is rebuilt, which has been dated to the Late Bronze 1B period. Now, Brian Wood would also have to redate the Late Bronze 1B pottery of the rebuilding to much later in the Iron Age if he believes that the early destruction is that of Abimelech in the time of the Judges. Now, it is far simpler and much less complicated to accept the Middle Bronze dating of the destruction level and move the date of the Middle Bronze period itself down to the biblical date of the early Judges period. Now, following a priestly rebellion in Nehemiah's time, the heretics went to Shechem, and they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim, and thus Shechem became the holy city of the Samaritans. Now, the Maccabees destroyed their temple in 128 BC, adding to the hostility between the Judean Jews and the heretical Samaritans. Now, it is often assumed that the Samaritans were Gentiles, but the New Testament writers seem to imply the opposite. Now, Matthew 15:24, Jesus said that he was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Yet it says in John 4 that Jesus needed to go through Samaria, where he met the woman at the well. And then we also see Philip preaching to the people of Samaria in Acts chapter 8, 2 chapters before the first official Gentile converts in Acts 10. Now, Jewish scholar Chaim Schaus, in his book The Jewish Festival, says this about the Samaritans. Modern historical researchers prove that Samaritans are not the descendants of the heathen colonists settled in the northern kingdom of Israel by the conquerors of Samaria, as was once assumed, nor are they to be identified with Nehemiah's opponents of the Persian period. Actually, the Samaritans of today are a small and poor remnant of an old and great Jewish sect that appeared in Palestine about the beginning of the Greek period. They form the oldest Jewish sect in existence. End of quote. Now, on an early trip back from Jerusalem, Jesus went via the bridge route back to Galilee, going through Samaria, where he met a Samaritan woman at a well near Shechem. Now, John 4:12 is the only reference we have of Jacob digging a well there. Now, today you can go there and visit what is believed to be this very same well, which is now housed within a Greek Orthodox church. Now, nearby on the north side of Shechem, on Mount Ebal, is what appears to be an Israelite altar that was dated to the Iron Age by its discoverer, Israeli archaeologist Adam Zertal, during the Hill Country, Manasseh Hill Country survey back in 1980. Now, it is made with uncut stones and seems to have a ramp rather than steps. which designates it as Israelite rather than Canaanite. Now, bone analysis of animals buried nearby shows that nearly all of them are clean sacrificial animals. Now, Zital suggested identifying it as Joshua's altar. Now, this and other finds converted Zital himself from being an atheist to a Torah believer, would you believe? Now, Stephen Rudd has redated this Iron Age structure to the late Bronze Age to bring it in line with a standard date for the conquest. Now, a scarab of a late Bronze pharaoh was found nearby, so his dating is not without merit. Now, if the conquest occurred during the Middle Bronze Age, as I've argued previously, and strongly supported by the archaeology at Shechem, then this structure is basically too late to be Joshua's altar. Now, there is one interesting possibility, if it is to be redated to the late Bronze Age as proposed by Stephen Rudd. It's a possibility that it may have been a local shrine built when Jeroboam I made Shechem as his capital, and it served in addition to the altars that he set up at Dan and Bethel that the Bible specifically mentions. Now, the structure itself sits in a bowl-shaped area on Mount Ebal, which is quite suitable for large gatherings. Now, the next site we're going to look at is the site of Shiloh. Now, Shiloh is located east of the ancient road known as the Ridge Route, or the Way of the Patriarchs. Now, in this beautiful area photo, you can see Highway 60, which closely follows the Way of the Patriarchs. Now, Shiloh is in Area C of the West Bank, so Israelis can visit this site, which I definitely took advantage of when I was there. It's about a 45-minute drive north of Jerusalem. Now, in Joshua 18, following the 7 years of the conquest, the Israelites went to Shiloh, where they set up the tabernacle of meeting. Now, Shiloh was chosen by God to be the site of the tabernacle, or the place where he would place his name, in relation to the daily sacrifices and the keeping of the festivals during the time of the judges. Now, that Shiloh was chosen is actually surprising given the amount of history that we've already looked at Shechem, with Abraham, Jacob, and being where the covenant was renewed. Now, Israel had no central civil capital during the time of the judges, but Shiloh did serve as a central religious capital during that particular period. Now, the name Shiloh means peace or tranquility. It's actually a variation of similar words such as Shalom, Shalom, and Solomon, which all mean peace. Now, this photo shows the view looking north from near the top of the Tel to where most scholars believe that the tabernacle itself was set up. Now, Israeli archaeologist and Bible critic Israel Finkelstein excavated the site back in the 1980s before the current excavation being done by the Associates of Bible Research under Scott Stripling. Now, about the site of Shiloh, Finkelstein wrote the following. Shiloh was first occupied in the period archaeologists call the Middle Bronze Age 2B. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Middle Bronze Age finds is that already in this period, there appears to have been a shrine at the site. Shiloh thus joins several other sacred Israelite sites where a cultic tradition had existed continuously ever since the Middle Bronze Age, long before the Israelite settlement in the 12th and 11th centuries BC, in a quote. Now, his deduction about a shrine comes from the type of objects found in storerooms along the city wall, dated to the Middle Bronze Age. Now, Alan Montgomery, on this statement by Finkelstein, notes the following. Had the Canaanites built a sanctuary there, the Israelites would have utterly destroyed it as commanded by Moses, and certainly they would not have established a new cult site over the top of a site involved in idolatry, end of quote. Now, like Finkelstein, the current head excavator, Scott Stripling, advocates that the first inhabitants of Shiloh were the Canaanites, based on the standard view that the conquest occurred during the late Bronze Age. And Deuteronomy 6:10-11 states that God would give them large and beautiful cities which you did not build, and houses full of good things which you did not fill. Now, is that true in light of there being a Middle Bronze Age shrine there? Now, was the site first occupied by the Canaanites, as advocated by Finkelstein and Scott Stripling? Or perhaps was it the Israelites who first occupied the site, not during the late Bronze Age, as commonly believed, but earlier on Egypt's timeline in the Middle Bronze Age? Well, based on what we looked at Shechem, we saw evidence that points to the Exodus and conquest occurring during the Middle Bronze Age, which would mean it would have been the Israelites themselves who would have first occupied Shiloh. Now, there have been some very interesting finds found here at Shiloh. A thick city wall surrounded Shiloh and was built in the Middle Bronze Age. Now, on the inside of the northwest side of this wall, for over 100 metres, were a series of storerooms found. Now, current excavator Scott Stripling believes that these were storerooms for the tithes that the Israelites prepared for the tabernacle. Now, as noted by Finkelstein, the bulk of the pottery found in these storerooms dates from the Middle Bronze Age, not the Late Bronze, when Stripling dates the Exodus. Now, a trench on the outside of the wall on the northeast side of the city was found to be a massive bone deposit of kosher animals designated as clean sacrificial animals. Now, they also found a clay pomegranate. And if you recall, alternating bells and pomegranates were hung off the hem of the high priest's robe. Now, Stripling's team have also uncovered the city's gate along the northern wall here. Now, a northern gate would make sense from the point of view that the city's water supply was a spring to the north, even though you enter the site today from the south. Now, they also found a room aligned east to west with similar dimensions as the tent within the tabernacle within the city walls, close to the northern gate. So, where was the tabernacle itself located? Well, the dominant view, popularised by early explorer Charles Wilson, is that it was on the flat area to the north of the city, shown in the photo I took here on the right. Now, others have suggested somewhere near the top of the tell, and also south of the city walls. Now, the southern site seems unlikely given the storehouses and the bone deposit are situated on the northern side of the city. Now, with the central site near the top of the tell, there's barely enough flat space, and you really wouldn't want to be slaughtering great numbers of animals so close to where most people are living within the city itself. And of course, it would get very congested come festival time with all the pilgrims. Now, Scott Stripling, for some unknown reason, seems to be very cold towards the possibility of the northern site being where the tabernacle was. Now, he has described it as a rock quarry, despite how almost perfectly rectangular it is, and so close to the measurements of the courtyard, 45 metres long and 22 metres wide, or about 2 cricket pitches long and 1 cricket pitch wide. Now, in this photo shot before the current excavation of the site, it looks more like artificial terracing than a rock quarry, and with its east to west alignment as required by the tabernacle, it seems the most obvious choice for the tabernacle location. Now, Stripling has suggested that the tabernacle may have rotated between all 3 locations, and more recently has leaned towards saying that it was within the northern gate, despite the room that he's uncovered being the site of just the tent of meeting and not the full courtyard. Now, I would hazard a guess that the room that he has found was actually the backup location where the tent was brought into the city whenever there was a threat of invasion. So here is the most likely tabernacle location to the north of the city walls. Now, you really have to imagine this place full of pilgrims from all over the land who have come for one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts, like the Feast of Tabernacles, with thousands camping on the surrounding hills, which act as a natural amphitheatre for the priests teaching the law to the people. In fact, lots of pottery have been found on the front side of these surrounding hills and far less on the other side of the hills. Now, it would have been on the eastern side of the tabernacle where Samuel's mother, Hannah, tearfully prayed for a son at the gate of the tabernacle. Now, there's one little detail in the story of Hannah that most people miss that illustrates God's wonderful generosity. Now, God was very touched by her faithfulness to give up Samuel for tabernacle service, and then he gave her something well and truly over and above what she had asked for. Now, we read in 1 Samuel 2, verse 21, "And the Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters." Now, she'd only asked for a son, yet because God was so moved by her faithfulness, he chose to give her another 5 children. Now, Finkelstein, in the previously quoted article, tells us that 2 destruction layers have been uncovered at Shiloh. Now, the first occurred at the very end of the Middle Bronze Age period, and the second occurred in the Iron Age. Now, by the standard chronology, the first one occurred in the 1500s while Israel was in Egypt, and the second is the one attributed to the Philistines around 1100 BC, or about 100 years before King David. Now, those who call for a change to Egypt's timeline and the pottery ages linked to Egypt's timeline see the Middle Bronze Age destruction as the one caused by the Philistines in 1100 BC. Now, they attribute the Iron Age destruction to either the Syrian king Hazael or the Assyrians at the time that the Northern Kingdom went into captivity. Now, we know Shiloh was repopulated after the Philistine destruction, as Ahijah the prophet in Jeroboam's time came from here. Now, when Jeremiah later says, "This house shall be like Shiloh," it strongly implies a more recent destruction than the one that occurred in Samuel's time. Now, the northern capital of Israel after the division in Rehoboam's reign had 3 capitals. Now, when Jeroboam broke away with the 10 tribes, he based himself in Shechem in between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, where Israel made a covenant with God. Now, he chose it for its historical connection to Abraham, Jacob and Joseph. Now, being in a valley made it vulnerable to attack, so by the time we get to the reign of Israel's 3rd king, Baasha, a new capital has been set up at Tirzah, perched above the next bend in the central valley. Now, the Northern Kingdom's 6th king was Omri, who was the father of Ahab. Now, Omri moved the capital from Tirzah to Samaria halfway into his reign, where it remained the capital of the Northern Kingdom until the end of the Northern Kingdom when they were conquered by the Assyrians. Now, Tirzah was the 2nd capital of the Northern Kingdom. Now, Tirzah is located about 20 kilometres northeast of Shechem, where the central valley through Samaria bends before reaching the Jordan River Valley. It is generally identified today with the site of Tel El Farah. Now, Jeroboam I possibly may have moved the capital to Tirzah late in his reign, though it only mentions that it is where his wife went to when she was in labour. Now, Tirzah was the capital during the reigns of Baasha, the 3rd king, Elah, Zimri, and the first half of Omri's reign before Omri moved the capital to Samaria. Now, the Northern Kingdom of Israel's 6th king was Omri, and who, as I mentioned, was the father of the wicked king Ahab. Now, when Omri gained sole reign over Israel, he began work on a new capital on a hill called Samaria to the northwest of Shechem, which continued as Israel's capital until the Assyrian conquest. Now, Omri probably felt a more elevated capital would give them more protection from attacks from the north and east. Now, it was further west than the 2 previous capitals, also giving a little more distance from their enemies. Now, during the reign of Ahab, it says that Hadad-ezer of Syria attacked it along with 32 vassal kings, but was defeated. A year later, he attacked it again, but he was utterly routed once more and was compelled to surrender to Ahab. Now, in the reign of Ahab's son Jehoram, Ben-Hadad of Syria laid siege to Samaria, and just when success seemed to be within its reach, his forces suddenly broke off the siege alarmed by a mysterious noise of chariots and horses and a great army. Now, following the Assyrian conquest, Samaria was occupied in subsequent periods. Now, in Roman times, Samaria was rebuilt by Herod the Great, and it was renamed Sebaste, which it's called today. Now, the two round towers near the west gate here and the colonnaded street date from the time of the Roman period, built by Herod the Great. Now, a palace was discovered here at Samaria back in the 1930s. Now, archaeologists believe that it was the one that was built by Omri. Now, the palace consisted of massive, roughly dressed blocks. It's comparable in size and splendour to palaces built at the same period in northern Syria. And it was surrounded by official administrative structures on the west and the northeast. Now, they also found 2 stone benches inside the gate entrance, which seem to correspond to the throne benches that Ahab and Judah's king Jehoshaphat sat on, that is referred to in 1 Kings 22:10. Now, excavations in the palace uncovered 500 pieces of carved ivory, portraying exotic animals and plants, mythological creatures, and foreign deities, amongst other things. Now, the time of the divided kingdom when Samaria was capital was a time of weakness in Egypt according to the standard chronology. Now, it was the time of Dynasty 22 and Egypt's third dark age, called the third intermediate period. Now, in Velikovsky's chronology, the first half of Samaria's time as capital falls during the much richer period of the 18th dynasty, when Egypt had a fair degree of overall hegemony over Palestine and Syria. Now, in his book Ages and Chaos, Emanuel Velikovsky wrote the following: "The excavators of Samaria were surprised. It is significant that in our iris there is no sign of Assyrian influence, and the influence of Egypt, on the other hand, is all pervasive. There are plaques which represent Egyptian gods. The subjects on furniture are all Egyptian." End of quote. Now, what was also surprising is that the style of the ivories matched those from the time of Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty. Now, late in that dynasty, the time of the Elamana letters, was a time that ivory was very much in fashion. And we see this also in the 800s BC according to the Bible. Now, 1 Kings 22:39 tells of Ahab building himself a house of ivory. In Amos 3:15, the prophet spoke against the sinners who dwelt in ivory houses, from which we get the phrase an ivory tower from. In Amos 6:4, he spoke against those who dwell at ease on their beds of ivory. Now, Tel Dothan is about 25 kilometres north of Samaria and about 35 kilometres north of Shechem, overlooking the plain of Dothan. Now, it is the focus of 2 stories in the Bible. Now, Dothan is first mentioned in connection with Joseph as the place where the sons of Jacob had moved their sheep to, and at the suggestion of Judah, the brothers sold Joseph to a passing caravan of traders. Now, the brothers, envious of Joseph, threw him into a pit initially, intending to kill him, but then, seeing a passing caravan, sold him. Now, there is a well there today along the road at the south of Tel Dothan, which may well be that very same well that Joseph was thrown into. Now, Dothan is later mentioned as the residence of Elisha. Now, when a Syrian army came to take Elisha, it was the scene of a vision of horses and chariots of fire surrounding the nearby mountains on which the city stood, that was given to encourage Elisha's young servant. Now, the expression chariots of fire would later be used for a movie about 2 British sprinters who both won gold medals at the 1924 Paris Olympics. Now, what happens after the vision of the chariots of fire is perhaps even more extraordinary. The Syrian army came to arrest Elisha. Now, he prayed that they would be struck with blindness. He then told them that he would take them to the man that they were looking for. And he then led that blinded army 25 kilometres south down the road. Now we then asked God to remove their blindness, and to their utter astonishment, they were within the city walls of Samaria. Now, Immanuel Velikovsky wrote an interesting paper called Hypnosis in the Bible. Now, he notes that a much different Hebrew word is translated blindness here in this passage than the usual word used elsewhere for blindness. Now, it is the word sambarim, which actually means fantasies. Now, the blindness in this passage does not appear to be the usual kind of blindness we think of, but an illusion or a case of virtual reality, like God put a VR headset on them without them realising it and then taking it off when they got into Samaria. Now, the Egyptian priest Manetho says the following about the Hyksos and their conquest of Egypt. Ptolemaeus, in his reign, I know not why, a blast of God's displeasure came upon us. A people of ignoble origin from the east, whose coming was unforeseen, had the audacity to invade the country which they mastered by main force, without difficulty or even a battle. Now, if the Exodus occurred in the Middle Bronze Age, when the Middle Kingdom collapsed and Egypt was conquered by a people without a battle, then it appears as if the mysterious Hyksos who ruled Egypt took advantage of Egypt after the plagues crippled them and she lost her army in the Red Sea. Now, who were these mysterious Hyksos invaders from the east? Well, Velikovsky, in his book Ages of Chaos, argued that they were the Amalekites. Now, we later find that when Saul was sent to utterly destroy the Amalekites, their power base, according to Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews, extended from Pelusium in Egypt to the Red Sea. Now, in the same book, Velikovsky wrote the following. The Song of Deborah, like the blessing of Balaam, is an old fragment. An obscure verse reads, out of Ephraim their root is in Amalek, Judges 5 verse 14. The verse cited seems to mean that the strength of the Canaanites was based upon the support that they received from the Amalekite citadel in the land of Ephraim. The citadel is also mentioned in another verse in the book of Judges. Pirathon, in the land of Ephraim, in the mount of the Amalekites, Judges 12:15. The Amalekites supported the Canaanites. This explains the reversal in the progress of the Israelite penetration into Canaan and their occasional status as vassals. The Amalekites ruled over vast territories, and in their colonial politics allied themselves with kindred nations, end of quote. Now, there are two main contenders for the location of Pirathon, where the Amalekite stronghold was. Now, one is Pharata to the west of Shechem, and the other is Farah, which is west of Shiloh. Now, Pharata on most maps of the tribal territories appears to be in Manasseh and not Ephraim as required, so Farah, the southern one, is probably the more likely of the two to be Pirathon or Mount Amalek. And here are photos of those two contenders for Pirathon. Pharata has the more impressive peak for a citadel, but it's questionable whether it is in Ephraim or Manasseh, and Farah in the bottom photo is more southern and probably more likely. Now, according to Joshua 24 verse 30, Joshua was buried at Timnath-Serah, which is considered by Orthodox Jews to be the Palestinian village of Kifl Haras, where there is a tomb shrine today. Now, thousands make the pilgrimage to the tomb on the annual commemoration of Joshua's death, believed to be the 26th of Nisan, about a couple of weeks after Passover. Now, Timnath-Serah is on the main road that goes from a little north of Shiloh to the coast at Tel Aviv via Aphek. Now, the town next door to Timnath-Serah, to Kifl Haras, is the town of Ariel. Now, when we were on a dig at Tel Burna for a week, the biblical Libna in the south, we actually had quite a large contingent of archaeology students from Ariel's University. Now, after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, the Pharisees and chief priests began plotting to put Jesus to death. So according to John 11:54, he went into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples until his last Passover in Jerusalem. Now, this town is believed to be the same town in the Old Testament referred to as Ophrah, which is today called Tabor. It was about 12 kilometres northeast of Ramallah and a few kilometres east of Highway 60 on the way up to Shiloh. Now, Tabor is actually the only all-Christian town in Palestinian West Bank today, and it's famous for having its own brewery and Oktoberfest celebration. Now, one of the most bloodiest battles in all of Israel's history is also one of its least known battles. Now, after Israel and Judah split into two kingdoms, there were a series of border wars between them. Now, after Rehoboam died, his son Abijah from Judah and Jeroboam of the northern kingdom faced off at a place called Mount Zemaraim. Now, there was a town in Benjamin called Zemaraim, but Mount Zemaraim appears to have been just over the border in Ephraim. Now, one of the leading candidates for Mount Zemaraim is Rimmon, just south of the town of Ephraim that we just looked at. Now, 2 Chronicles 13 tells us that, led by Jeroboam I, Israel had 800,000 men, and Judah, led by Abijah, had 400,000 men. Now, Israel had Judah in an ambush, surrounded back and front, but God delivered Judah. Now, Israel lost a staggering 500,000 men in that battle. That's about, put that in perspective, that's about 10 times as many that died in the Battle of Somme. Now, we first hear about Bethel as a place where Abraham set up camp and an altar on a mountain between Bethel and Ai. Now, later Jacob stays there overnight on his way to Haran, where he has a dream about a stairway to heaven. Now, Bethel is then mentioned as a close-by town to Ai when Joshua and the Israelites conquer the town of Ai. Now, there have been three main contenders proposed for the site of Bethel, and also three contenders proposed for the site of Ai. Now, Beitin for a long time was thought to be Bethel, and Etel thought to be Ai. Now, the main problem with Etel was its size. Now, Etel is 4 times bigger than Gibeon, though the Bible says that Ai was actually smaller. Now, because of this, the Associates of Bible Research was set up to resolve the problem of where Ai was. Now, for a long time, they proposed and excavated Khirbet Nissa, but came up empty as far as a wall went. Now, they gave up on it and then discovered Khirbet El Makata, close to Etel, just off Highway 60. Now, it proved to fit the requirements of Ai perfectly. And they have proposed that El Bira was the biblical Bethel, which is west of Makata. Now, Beitin is more north than west of Makata, and El Bira better fits the distance of 12 miles north of Jerusalem as recorded by Eusebius and Jerome. Now, another more recent proposal for Bethel is Chalom Yaakov, which means dream of Jacob, but it's further north again than the distance required. Now, here's a great photo to help you to visualise the Battle of Ai that's told in Joshua 8. Now, Joshua sent 5,000 men south around to that deep valley not visible from Ai. Now, north of the city there is a shallow valley and a hill where Joshua would have called out to the men of Ai, who engaged with Joshua, who then fled east, drawing them away from the city. Now, Joshua signalled the 5,000 men hidden in the valley charged up to Ai and then set it on fire. Now there's another hill on the western side of that deep valley there, on the right of the photo. Now this is likely to be the mountain between Bethel and Ai, where Abraham set up camp and built an altar. Now it is possible that Jacob may have had his dream of a stairway to heaven there as well. Now the Associates for Biblical Research excavated Khurba del Markazah and found that it had a single gate on its northern side, which would lead them out to Joshua on the north of the city. It also had a burn layer, which was another requirement for Ai. Now, so this location was actually a small fortress that was smaller than Gibeon as required, and probably looked something like the illustration on the right. Now Bethel was where Jeroboam set up one of the two golden calves as a corrupted form of worshipping God after the kingdom split into two following Solomon's death. Now what was amazing was the general acceptance of the golden calf, given the same story about the golden calf that the people would have been well familiar with during the time of the Exodus at Mount Sinai. Now in 1 Kings 13 we read that a prophet came to the altar when Jeroboam was about to burn incense, and he gave a prophecy about the destruction of the high place at Bethel. Now this unnamed prophet even named the king who would do it. He referred to him as Josiah by name. Now nearly 300 years later, King Josiah destroyed the altar and the high place as recorded in 2 Kings 23 verse 15. Now if El Bira is the correct location for Bethel, then the high hill known as Ras et Tahuna is likely to have been where that high place was located. Now north of Jerusalem and before you get to Bethel, there are a number of other biblically important sites like Ramah, where Samuel is from, Gibeon, Michmash, Mitzvah, and Gibeah, where Saul is from. Now being north of Jerusalem, they can seem like they are part of Samaria, but in fact they're actually a part of Benjamin. Now the tribe of Benjamin stayed loyal to Judah and was a part of the southern kingdom of Judah, rather than went with Joseph in the north, represented by the half-tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Now remember that Benjamin and Joseph were both sons of Rachel, but as a tribe, Benjamin was loyal to Judah. So we'll cover those cities in Benjamin the next time when we explore southern Israel in part 3. Now I'm scheduled to be up here next on January 6th, so I look forward to continuing my series with you then. Thank you.